Hey everyone, you ready to dive deep? Today, it's all about toxic relationships. We're going deep using Psychopath Free by Jackson MacKenzie. And this book is, well, it's like gold. If you've been through a toxic relationship or, hey, maybe you just want to avoid them in the future, this one's for you. We're going to get some serious clarity today, some real actionable steps you can take.
It's going to be good. Toxic relationships, well, they're complicated. There's so much to unpack, and it can be really hard to actually see them while you're in them.
Exactly. And I think that's why this book is so powerful. It shines a light on those red flags.
Uh-huh.
Right off the bat, Mackenzie dives into the classic traits of toxic people. Two things that really stood out to me were emotional manipulation and gaslighting. We hear those terms a lot these days, but they can be kind of fuzzy.
Yeah, they get thrown around a lot.
So help us out here.
Mm-hmm.
What do these tactics actually look like in a real relationship? How can our listeners spot them?
Okay, so first, it's important to remember that emotional manipulation and gaslighting, they're usually not these big, dramatic explosions. They're often super subtle, which is why they can be so hard to pinpoint. Emotional manipulation, at its core, is about control. It's about the manipulator getting their needs met no matter what.
Okay, so what? How does that actually play out?
Think guilt trips, the silent treatment, making you feel responsible for their emotions. It's this constant pressure to conform to what they want, how they want you to behave, what they want you to feel. You end up walking on eggshells all the time because you're always trying to avoid setting them off.
Ooh, I know that feeling. It's exhausting.
Exactly. And then there's gaslighting, which is even more insidious.
Okay, so tell me about gaslighting.
It's almost like psychological warfare on your perception of reality. They deny things that happen, they twist your words, they flat out lie, and eventually you start to feel like you're going crazy.
Wow, that's intense.
It is. Gaslighting is designed to erode your trust in yourself, to make you doubt your memories, your instincts, even your sanity.
That is scary. And I think that's what makes this book so important. It helps you see those things, name them, and realize you're not alone. And then Mackenzie takes it a step further. He explains how these toxic relationships can actually rewire our brains. This whole concept of trauma bonding was mind-blowing to me. Can you break that down for our listeners? What's going on in our brains when we're in these situations?
Trauma bonding, it's fascinating, isn't it? It's like this terrible paradox. Our brains are wired for connection, for love, for belonging, right? That's how we're built. But in a toxic relationship, that wiring gets hijacked. Instead of bonding us to someone who's good for us, we become intensely attached to someone who's actually hurting us.
So why does that happen?
It's a survival mechanism. In the chaos and pain of a toxic relationship, your brain is desperately trying to find some safety, some stability, some sense of normalcy. So it clings to those fleeting moments of good feeling, those crumbs of affection, and it magnifies them.
It's like you're searching for anything positive to hold on to.
Exactly. And those intermittent rewards create this powerful bond, even though the overall relationship is harmful. It's kind of similar to what happens with hostages and their captors. A bond can form even in the midst of abuse because the hostage's brain is trying to survive.
Wow. Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So we're starting to understand how these toxic relationships work, how they mess with our heads. But how do we break free? I mean, knowing about trauma bonding is one thing, but actually breaking those bonds, that feels like a whole other challenge.
It is a challenge, absolutely, but it is possible. Psychopath Free is full of practical strategies for healing, and one of the biggest things is rebuilding self-esteem.
Okay, so how do we do that? Our
Right.
self-esteem's been, trampled on. How do we pick up the pieces?
It starts with recognizing that the toxic person's view of you, well, it's distorted. It's not the truth. You have inherent worth, regardless of what they said or did. And a big part of rebuilding self-esteem is shifting your focus. Instead of dwelling on the negative, start intentionally celebrating your wins, your strengths, even the small things you do well each day.
I like that.
And Mackenzie actually suggests a really cool journaling exercise for this. He says to write down 3 things you did well each day, no matter how small. It could be anything, like making a healthy meal, finishing a work project, or even just getting out of bed when it felt impossible.
Oh, I love that. It's like giving yourself little gold stars.
Exactly. It's a way to retrain your brain to focus on the positive and to remind yourself that you are capable, you are worthy, and you have a lot to offer.
So that's self-esteem. What about boundaries? That feels huge, especially after being in a relationship where your boundaries were constantly violated. Where do you even start with that?
Starting with boundaries is key, and you're right, it can feel overwhelming after being in a situation where your boundaries were ignored or trampled on, but it's so important.
So where do you begin?
The first step is simply recognizing that you deserve to have boundaries. You deserve to be treated with respect, to have your needs met, to say no without guilt. And it's okay if that feels radical or uncomfortable at first.
Yeah, it's like unlearning all that bad programming.
Exactly. You've been conditioned to prioritize the toxic person's needs above your own. So now it's time to recenter yourself. And the best way to do that is to start small. Maybe it's declining a social invitation you don't feel comfortable with, or saying no to an unreasonable request at work, or speaking up when someone says something that hurts your feelings.
I love that. Start small. Those little acts of self-respect, they can add up to big changes.
They absolutely do. Each time you assert yourself, you're reinforcing that inner strength and sending a message that your needs matter. And you know what? As you start setting those boundaries, you might be surprised by how the people around you respond. The right people will respect your boundaries.
It's like you attract a whole new tribe when you start honoring yourself.
Exactly. And that leads to healthier, more fulfilling relationships.
I want to touch on a couple more things Mackenzie talks about because I think they're super relevant to healing. Mindfulness and reframing negative thoughts. How do those fit into the recovery process?
Mindfulness and reframing, they're powerful tools for, well, for pretty much anything, but especially for recovering from a toxic relationship.
Explain how.
Mindfulness is all about becoming aware of your thoughts and feelings without judgment. It's like taking a step back and observing those negative thought patterns that were triggered by the toxic person. You notice them, you acknowledge them, but you don't get swept away by them.
Because you're not fighting them, you're just observing them.
Exactly. It's like watching clouds drift by. They're there, but you don't have to grab onto them. And then reframing is about consciously shifting your perspective on those thoughts. It's about challenging the negative stories you've been telling yourself and choosing to see things in a more empowering light.
So give me an example of that. Like, how would you reframe a thought like, I'm not good enough?
Okay, so let's say that thought pops up. Instead of getting stuck in that loop of, I'm not good enough, you could reframe it to something like, I was strong enough to survive that relationship, and now I'm learning and growing from that experience.
Oh, I love that. So it's like you're taking back your power. You're choosing how you see yourself, how you define your experience.
Exactly. And that's what reclaiming your narrative is all about.
Right. Because that's a big theme in the book, this idea that you've been through a lot, you've been hurt, but that experience doesn't define you.
Exactly. You get to decide how you move forward. You get to choose what that experience means to you.
What are your thoughts on that? Like, how does that empower people?
I think it's incredibly empowering. It's saying, yes, I was hurt, but I'm not a victim, I'm a survivor. And it's about recognizing your own strength and agency in a situation where you may have felt powerless. Reclaiming your narrative means taking ownership of your story. And that's how you heal, that's how you grow, and that's how you create a brighter future.
So to recap, we've learned about those toxic traits, those subtle but powerful ways people can manipulate and control others. We've talked about how these relationships literally affect our brains, creating those intense trauma bonds. But we've also explored some really amazing actionable steps you can take to heal. Like that journaling exercise for self-esteem, starting small with those boundaries, practicing mindfulness and reframing those negative thoughts. I think maybe the biggest takeaway here is that you are not alone.
That's so important to remember. You are not alone, and you can heal.
And you can go on to have amazing, healthy, loving relationships.
Absolutely. And, here's a final thought to leave you with. As you're healing and moving forward, think about this. How might understanding the dynamics of toxic relationships, all the things we've talked about today, actually help you to identify and cultivate healthier relationships in the future?
Because knowledge is power.
Exactly. Knowledge is power. And your healing journey, it doesn't just benefit you, it can actually ripple out and create positive change in the world.
All right, everyone, that's our deep dive for today. Go check out Psychopath Free by Jackson MacKenzie if you want to learn more.
It's a game changer. And remember, you're not alone, and you can heal. We'll see you next time. See ya!